The boy on the water wagon saw it first. He was 10, perched high on the bench seat with the reins slack in his lap, waiting for his father to finish at the camp store. Below him, in the road dust, a woman knelt beside a trunk and a bedroll that had been dumped there the way you dump wash water fast, without looking where it lands. The morning shift was filing past. Not one man stopped. The camp bookkeeper stood 6 feet away, holding a folded paper he never read aloud, because everyone already knew what it said. The boy watched the woman close the trunk. She did not look at the bookkeeper. She did not look at the men walking past. She stood, gripped the trunk's leather handle, and began dragging it, not toward the wagon road out of the valley, but uphill, toward the logged slope where nothing stood but stumps and dry grass and heat. Clara Voss owned $41, a shovel with a cracked collar, and a reputation no one in camp would trade for. The superintendent's dismissal had not come as paper or ceremony. It came as her trunk dumped beside the wagon rut in full view of the morning shift, her bedroll tossed on top like an afterthought, and the camp bookkeeper standing 6 feet away holding a folded note he never opened because everyone within earshot already knew what it said. She was out, not for stealing, not for laziness, not for any of the reasons a woman got removed from a logging camp in 1909. She was out for talking, specifically for talking about fire. The camp sat in a cut valley above the Pen d'Oreille drainage in northeastern Washington, where the Northern Pacific spur lines had opened the timber 2 decades earlier, and companies had been pulling Douglas fir and tamarack out of those hills ever since. 36 structures made of wood, roofs of shake and rough board, bunkhouses set 30 feet apart with slash piled between them, bark, limbs, sawdust, the discarded guts of every tree the saws had touched since spring. The cookhouse shared a wall with a drying shed stacked floor to ceiling with split kindling. And this was the camp where Clara Voss had spent 4 months washing linens and peeling potatoes and watching the forest get drier by the week until she could not keep her mouth shut any longer. She had told the cook first, then the teamsters, then anyone who stood still long enough. The slash is too close. The roofs are tinder. A single lightning strike west of the ridge and this whole camp goes in 20 minutes. She had refused to pile kitchen ash against the cookhouse wall where the foreman wanted it. She had argued publicly in the mess line that every cord of bark stacked within arm's reach of a bunkhouse was a fuse waiting for a match. Elias Boone, the camp foreman, had listened to exactly one of these speeches before deciding Clara Voss was a problem. Boone was 58 years old. He had worked timber in the Cascades, the Blues, and the Bitterroots. He had fought 3 fires with axe lines and bucket brigades, and he had survived all 3 by doing what timbermen did, cutting a line, wetting what you could, and running when you had to. He did not need a 24-year-old washwoman telling him how fire worked. He found her behind the cookhouse the morning after she had kicked apart a pile of cedar bark someone had stacked against the rear wall. She was still holding a rake. "You scatter that pile again," Boone said, "and I scatter you." Clara looked at the bark on the ground and then at the wall it had been leaning against. "That pile was touching dry siding, Mr. Boone. A single ember lands in that and the cookhouse catches before anyone smells smoke." Boone crossed his arms. He had forearms like fence posts and a beard that collected sawdust the way a river collects leaves. "I have fought fire since before your mother had teeth. You want to tell me how a kitchen bark pile threatens a camp?" "It does not threaten a camp," Clara said. "It threatens this wall, and this wall shares framing with the drying shed. And the drying shed holds enough split wood to cook the bunkhouse next door. That is enough. 3 fires in 30 years, Mr. Boone. How many camps did you see burn that did not need to?" Boone stepped closer. His voice did not rise. That was worse. "The superintendent has asked me to remind you that you wash clothes and peel potatoes. If you want to fight fire, find a crew that will take you. This one will not." That was Tuesday. By Thursday, she was standing beside her trunk in the road dust, watching the morning shift pretend not to look. She had 3 weeks of flour, beans, and salt pork. She had a broad axe, a grub hoe, the cracked handle cross-cut saw, a lantern, and a bedroll. She did not have a husband, a land title, relatives in the territory, or paid passage back to Nebraska. The mule she had been using to haul water belonged to the camp. She could walk out on the wagon road and try to reach Usk or Medline, but a woman alone on a timber road with no money and no connections was not walking toward opportunity. She was walking toward worse. The brutal arithmetic was simple, and it was ugly. $41 could buy her maybe 2 months of board in a settlement town if she found one that would take her, but board without work was just a slower kind of starving. She could not homestead without filing fees and 6 months of provisions. She could not get cook work in another camp without a reference Boone would never write. And every day that passed, the woods around this valley got drier. She could feel it in the crack of old needles under her boots. She could see it in the stumps, bone white and splitting in the heat. She could smell it in the pitch bleeding from every standing fir within 100 yards. Clara Voss did not walk down the wagon road toward Usk. She dragged her trunk uphill. The slope above camp was a ragged thing, logged on its lower half and left with a stubble of stumps and fireweed, still timbered on its upper third where the grade had been too steep for the skid roads. Clara had walked it twice during her months in camp, both times following a game trail that switchbacked through Salal and Oregon grape before opening onto a south-facing fold where the hillside creased like a bent elbow. The soil there was different. Pale, mineral-heavy, packed tight enough that boot heels barely dented it. The grass was thin, the brush was sparse. It reminded her of something. She had grown up in eastern Nebraska on a homestead her mother held alone after Clara's father died of typhoid when Clara was 6. The house, if it deserved the name, was a dugout cut into a low-rise above Plum Creek, walled with sod and roofed with willow poles and packed earth. Clara had spent her first 12 years in that dugout. She knew what earth walls felt like in summer, how the packed clay stayed cool when the air outside shimmered, how the dark interior held its temperature like a fist holding a stone. She knew what a grass fire looked like from inside one, too. She had been 8 the year the fire came through. Her mother had pulled her inside, stuffed rags against the doorframe, and made her lie flat on the dirt floor while the sky outside turned orange, and the sound of the grass burning was like 1,000 sheets of paper crumpling at once. They came out an hour later to find the sod roof untouched, the earth walls untouched, and the wooden fence posts burned to charcoal nubs. Her mother had walked her around the dugout afterward, pointing. See the walls. See the roof. What burned? Clara said the fence, the grass, the shed where they kept the harness. Her mother nodded. What did not burn? The ground, Clara said. The dirt. Her mother pressed Clara's hand against the dugout wall. It was barely warm. Fire must be fed before it can be feared, her mother said. Take away the food and it starves like anything else. Clara had filed that lesson the way children file everything, loosely without knowing what it was worth. It came back to her 15 years later on a Wednesday afternoon in July of 1909, standing on a south-facing slope above a logging camp that was going to burn. She saw 2 things within the same hour. First, a lightning-struck snag had toppled the previous night and lay smoldering on a patch of bare mineral dirt between stumps. The ground was scorched in a circle no wider than a wagon wheel. The fire had gone nowhere. It had nothing to climb into, nothing to spread across. The dirt had starved it. Second, 50 yards downhill, a sawyer's discarded slash pile had caught a spark, possibly from the same storm, and was burning freely in a bed of dry needles, orange and crackling, and reaching for the nearest standing tree with the enthusiasm of something alive. The contrast hit her like a slap. Same lightning, same night. One fire died on dirt. The other fire ate everything it touched. She stood on the mineral slope and looked at the fold in the hill and thought about her mother's hand on the dugout wall. Cool packed earth. 3 feet of it between the prairie fire and the room where she slept. The roof had not burned because it was not a roof. It was ground. The walls had not burned because they were not walls. They were hillside. The fire had passed over and around and found nothing it recognized as fuel, and it had moved on. Clara crouched and scraped the surface dirt with her thumbnail. Underneath the first inch of duff, the soil was dense, mineral, gravelly, not sand, too cohesive, not clay, too granular, something between the kind of packed glacial till that held its shape when you cut it. Good digging, good packing, the kind of dirt you could pile 3 feet deep on a roof and trust it to stay. The logic built itself in her mind like a wall going up, course by course. Wood fails because it ignites. A cabin dies when embers find gaps, when radiant heat cooks the siding, when flame sits against the wall long enough to catch. Every structure in camp was built to hold rain off and wind out, and every one of those structures would feed a fire the way dry kindling feeds a stove. But dirt does not ignite. A hill is already shielded on 3 sides. If she cut into the slope, say 12 by 16 feet, 6 feet deep at the back, and roofed it with heavy timbers, cross-laid saplings, and then buried the whole thing under 3 feet of mineral soil, the roof would not be a roof anymore. It would be ground. The fire would walk over it the way it had walked over the dugout in Nebraska, the way it had walked over the snag on Bear Dirt this morning, but the shelter alone was not enough. She knew that too. She could bury herself under 6 feet of earth and still die if flame sat against the front wall long enough to ignite the exposed timbers, or if burning brush piled against the entrance and cooked the air inside. The shelter needed space, clear space, a ring of bare ground around it wide enough that no flame could reach the walls with sustained heat. 100 feet. That was the number she kept coming back to. 100 feet of bare mineral soil between the shelter entrance and anything that could burn. 100 feet was a circle 200 feet across. That was a lot of ground to strip by hand. Every bush, every grass clump, every piece of bark and slash and dry root within that ring had to go. And the shelter itself, the excavation, the cribbing, the timbers, the overburden, was weeks of labor for one woman with hand tools and no mule. Marta Cerny found her that evening. Marta was the camp laundress, a Czech woman of 30 who had come west with a husband who died of gangrene in a sawmill accident and stayed because she had nowhere else to be. She was Clara's only real friend in camp, and she climbed the slope with a canvas sack of biscuits and a face that said she already knew what Clara was planning. "You are building something," Marta said. It was not a question. Clara showed her the fold in the hill. She explained the excavation, the roof, the overburden, the cleared ring. She explained the Nebraska dugout and the lightning snag and the 2 fires on the same night. Marta listened. She walked the slope. She looked at the tree line and the distance to camp and the exposed rock where the grade steepened. Then she said what a practical woman says, "The roof will collapse. 3 feet of dirt on timber. The weight will crush it before fire gets the chance." "Not if the timbers are heavy enough and close enough," Clara said. "Peeled tamarack, 10 inches through, set on 2-foot centers. Cross-laid saplings above. Brush mat, then clay, then packed soil. You have no tamarack. You have no way to haul tamarack. There are downed trees on the upper slope. Blowdown from last winter. I can limb them and skid them by hand." Marta shook her head. "And if the roof holds and the dirt holds, you will suffocate. You seal yourself inside a hole with fire burning overhead, and the air goes bad in minutes." "Ventilation," Clara said. "A low intake pipe on the downhill side, screened and baffled. A rear vent above the back wall that I can plug with wet cloth and clay when the front heats. I do not need much air. I need enough air for a few hours." "A few hours?" "The front will pass. Fire does not stay in one place when it has fuel ahead of it. The flames move. If nothing near the shelter is burning, the heat drops fast." Marta sat on a stump. She ate one of her own biscuits. "You have $41. $41 in about 6 weeks before lightning season gets serious. And if the roof holds and the air holds and the fire passes and you come out alive, then what? You have a hole in a hill and no camp to work in and no money left? Clara looked downhill toward the camp. 36 wooden buildings, shake roofs, piled like offerings to something hungry. If the fire comes the way I think it is coming, she said, there will not be a camp to work in anyway. Marta did not answer that. She left the biscuits and walked back down. The word spread before Clara's first shovel stroke hit dirt. In a camp of 80 men and 4 women, gossip traveled faster than the mail wagon. By Friday morning, every sawyer, choker setter, and teamster in the valley knew that the washwoman who got fired for talking about fire was now digging a hole in the hillside like a badger. Silas Pike heard about it at the camp store. Pike was the timber buyer and company agent, a lean man of 42, who wore a town hat in the woods and carried a pocket ledger the way other men carried tobacco. His job was volume, feet of lumber per week, loads per rail car. He had no patience for anything that slowed production, and Clara Voss had been slowing production since June, first with her fire warnings, which made Green Hands nervous, and now with her dramatic hilltop project, which gave those same green hands something to joke about instead of work. But Pike's objection was not just about efficiency. Clara had been scavenging. Abandoned timbers near old skid roads, discarded nail kegs behind the blacksmith shed, a canvas tarp that had been thrown over a slash pile and forgotten. She claimed these things were waste. Pike called them company property. It was a small thing, but small things embarrassed company agents, and Pike did not tolerate embarrassment. He rode up to her clearing on a Saturday with 2 teamsters flanking him like a mounted escort. Clara was on her knees in the trench she had started, grubbing roots from the exposed cut. She had dug 3 feet down into the mineral soil, and the walls were holding clean, pale and dense as old plaster. Pike did not dismount. He looked down at her from the saddle, the way a man looks at something that has crawled out from under a log. You want a house, Voss? Build one above ground like Christians do. Clara wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist. A Christian roof burns the same as any other. The teamsters grinned. Pike did not. You are on company timber lease land. You are using company salvage, and you are making this operation look like it cannot manage its own people. I am building a shelter on a slope no one has claimed or cut. I'm using timbers your crews left to rot. And I am not your people anymore. Mr. Boone saw to that. Pike leaned forward in the saddle. I can have the sheriff's man from Usk up here inside of a week. Trespass and theft of company materials. Then send him. He can watch me dig. Pike straightened. He looked at the trench, at the piles of grubbed brush, at the rope stakes marking the perimeter ring. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he does not understand and therefore resents. Then he turned his horse downhill. As he passed the teamsters, he said it loud enough for Clara to hear, loud enough for anyone on the slope to hear. She's building herself a grave with a door. The teamsters laughed. Their laughter carried down the slope and into the camp like rocks rolling downhill. By supper, everyone had heard the line. By the next morning, it was the camp's favorite joke. Clara heard it. She kept digging. The consequences arrived within days, practical and specific. Boone posted a notice at the camp store. No company water, supplies, or facilities for non-employees. Clara had been drawing from the camp well. That ended. She had been buying flour and salt at the company's store at employee prices. That ended, too. Even Marta could not visit openly anymore. Pike had made it clear that anyone seen helping the woman on the hill was choosing a side. And in a camp where the company controlled wages, housing, and the only store within 15 miles choosing a side meant choosing carefully. Clara hauled water from a seep spring Jonas would later show her, but for the first week she carried it from the creek below camp, a half-mile round trip downhill and back up, with a single bucket and a yoke she fashioned from a forked branch. 2 trips a day. 2 hours of walking she could not spend digging. The math of isolation was not abstract. It cost her daylight. One evening she came down to the creek and found two sawyers sitting on the bank, eating their supper. They watched her fill her bucket. One of them, a young man named Collis with a sunburned neck and honest eyes, said quietly, "Is it true you're digging some kind of fort up there?" "A shelter," Clara said, "not a fort. Against the fire. Against whatever comes." Collis looked at his companion, then back at Clara. "Pike says you are touched in the head." Clara lifted the bucket onto the yoke. Water sloshed over her boots. "Pike has not looked at the slash around his own bunkhouse. Ask him how many seconds it would take bark shavings to carry flame from the mill waste to his front door." She climbed the hill. Behind her, Collis said nothing more, but she felt his eyes on her back until the trail turned. There were people in camp who were not laughing. They were watching. But watching and helping were different animals, and fear of Pike kept the helpful ones silent. The construction started with the ring, not the shelter, and that confused everyone who watched. A woman alone on a hillside, and instead of digging her living space, she spent the first week on her hands and knees pulling brush, cutting grass to the root crowns, raking needle litter, and dragging everything she cleared downhill away from the site. She worked in expanding circles from where the shelter entrance would face, moving outward with the grub hoe and the rake, and her bare hands when the tools were too clumsy for the work. She did the ring first because she understood what the skeptics did not. The shelter meant nothing if fire could sit against it. 3 feet of earth on the roof would not matter if burning slash lay against the front wall for 10 minutes. The cleared ring was not a luxury. It was the mechanism. Without it, the buried roof was just a buried coffin. The work was brutal, and it was slow. 100 feet of clearance in every direction from the entrance meant stripping a vast fan of hillside down to mineral soil. Every salal bush had roots like wire cable. Every clump of bear grass clung to the ground as if it knew what was coming. The fireweed came up easily, but there was so much of it that her forearms were stained purple by the second day, and her palms were blistered by the third. Old slash from the logging operation, bark slabs, limb butts, shattered chunks of sapwood had to be carried or rolled downhill because she had no cart and no mule. She worked from first light until she could not see her hands. She ate cold beans from a tin and slept in her bedroll under a salvaged tarp stretched between two stumps. The nights were warm and dry, too dry. The stars were hard and white, and the air tasted of dust and resin. No rain had fallen in 11 days. The creek below camp was running thin enough that she could see individual stones on the bottom from 20 feet away. By the end of the first week, she had cleared roughly a third of the perimeter arc on the uphill side and started the excavation itself. The digging was better than the clearing. The mineral soil cut clean with the shovel and held its walls. She marked the footprint with rope, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep into the slope. At the back wall, she would cut 6 feet down from the surface. The front wall would be partially exposed, with a low entrance framed in timber. But the progress markers told a hard story. 1/3 of the ring in 7 days. At that pace, the full clearance would take 3 weeks. The excavation, another 2. The roofing and overburden, another 2 after that. 7 weeks total, and she had started in early July. Lightning season in the inland northwest typically ran from mid-July through September. She was building against a clock she could not see, and the clock was already running. The first setback came on day 9. She had cut the trench 4 feet deep on the left side when a section of wall sloughed inward overnight. A pocket of loose sand she had not detected gave way, spilling Phil back into the excavation and burying her grub hoe. She spent a full day recutting and bracing the weakened section with salvaged planks, losing time she did not have. The second setback came on day 12. The borrowed mule, she had been sneaking it from the camp pasture at dawn and returning it at dusk, was reclaimed. A stable hand told her Boone had noticed and locked the gate. Without the mule, every heavy timber she needed for the roof would have to be dragged by hand from the blowdown field a quarter-mile upslope. She tried it that afternoon with a single tamarack log, 10 inches through and 14 feet long. It took her 90 minutes to skid it down the slope and position it beside the trench. She needed at least 8 more for the main beams alone. On day 14, she sliced her left palm open on a split timber edge while debarking a fir pole. The cut ran from the base of her thumb to the heel of her hand, deep enough to see white before the blood came. She packed it with clean cloth and pine pitch and kept working with one hand for the rest of the day. But the next morning the hand was swollen and hot, and she lost 2 full days waiting for the swelling to go down enough to grip a tool. Her hands were cracked and swollen. Her shoulders ached from the grub hoe. She had lost weight she could not afford to lose, and her flour sack was already a third empty. At night, lying under the tarp, she could hear thunder rolling along the ridgeline to the west. Dry thunder. No rain following it. Just the sound of electricity hitting timber and the knowledge that somewhere up there, a snag was smoldering. She was building a shelter no one believed in, on land no one had given her, with tools that were breaking against a deadline that was invisible and absolute. Every day the sky stayed clear was both a gift and a warning. The fire was not a question of whether, it was a question of when. And she still had 67 feet of perimeter to clear. If you have ever built something that no one else believed in, tell us in the comments. Because Clara Voss was about to meet the one person in that valley who understood exactly what she was doing. She met Jonas Thorne because she was stealing his stones. The old kiln site sat 2 miles east along a game trail that followed the contour of the ridge. It had been a charcoal burning operation years earlier, a beehive kiln of stacked basalt and river cobble, half collapsed now, with a scatter of flat stones around the base that were perfect for cribbing and drainage work. Clara had found it on a scouting walk and had been carrying stones back in a canvas sling, 4 or 5 at a time, building a small pile near her excavation for the front wall footing. She was loading her 3rd trip when a voice came from the tree line behind her. "You are taking my kiln apart." She turned. The man standing at the edge of the clearing was old, 60 or better, with a white beard trimmed close and hands that were too large for his wrists, the way a working man's hands get after decades of tools. He wore a canvas coat even in the heat and carried a short-handled mattock like it was part of his arm. "The kiln is abandoned," Clara said. "I thought it was scrap." "It is scrap, but it is my scrap." He walked closer. Not threatening, curious. His eyes went to the stones in her sling, then to the direction she had come from, then back to her face. "What do you need flat basalt for?" "Cribbing. I am building a shelter cut into the hill above the logging camp." "A dugout?" "Yes." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when something confirms a suspicion rather than surprises him. "What is the soil?" "Glacial till, dense, holds a clean wall to 4 feet. I hit a sand pocket on the left side, but the rest is solid." "What is the roof plan?" "Peeled tamarack and fir, 10-inch minimum, 2-foot centers, cross-laid saplings, brush mat, clay layer, then 3 feet of packed mineral overburden." Jonas Thorne looked at her for a long time. He looked at her the way Boone never had, and Pike never would, not as a woman making a scene, but as a person who had just described a structure with the language of someone who understood soil bearing and load distribution. "You have built before," he said. "I grew up in one, Nebraska, my mother's dugout on Plum Creek." "And you are building this one because of the fire?" It was not a question. Clara stared at him. "You know." Jonas Thorne sat down on the ruined kiln wall and rested his mattock across his knees. "I have been burning charcoal in these woods for 9 years. I know what dry timber looks like, and I know what slash looks like, and I know what a camp full of green wood and no clearance looks like. I have been waiting for someone in that camp to notice." He paused. "I did not expect it to be the washwoman they fired." "Former washwoman. Former washwoman." He almost smiled. "Show me your sight." They walked back together. Jonas moved slowly but steadily, reading the ground the way Clara had seen her mother read soil, automatically, the way literate people read signs. When they reached the excavation, he spent 10 minutes walking the perimeter in silence. He tested the trench walls with his thumbnail. He sighted along the slope for drainage. He stood at the point where the roof would begin and looked uphill, calculating something Clara could not follow. Then he spoke, and what he said was not praise and not criticism. It was instruction. "Your timbers are fine at 10 inches, but you need to sound them. Knock the butt end with a mallet. A clear ring means the grain is straight and the wood is sound. A dull thud means rot or twist inside. A twisted beam under 3 feet of dirt will crack before winter, and if it cracks during fire, the whole roof comes down on you." Clara listened. She did not argue. She had been right about the principle. She needed to be right about the execution. "Second thing," Jonas said, "you have no drainage upslope. When it does rain, and it will eventually, that water will run down the back of the hill and soak into your rear wall. Wet earth is heavy earth, and heavy earth on an unsupported back wall will slump inward. You need a swale cut above the shelter, angled to shed water around both sides." I had not thought of that. "Third thing, your cracks." He pointed to the joint where the trench wall met the floor of the excavation. "When the fire comes, the embers will be fine, dust-sized. They will find every gap. You need to plaster every joint and seam with a mix of clay and ash. Pack it, let it dry, pack it again. Do not leave a crack wide enough to pass a blade of grass." He picked up a handful of the mineral soil and rubbed it between his fingers. He let it fall. He looked at Clara with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life, the look of a man who has found something worth his remaining time. "I will help you," Jonas Thorne said. "Not because you need help, because you are doing the only intelligent thing anyone in this valley has done all summer, and it would be a waste to let you do it with cracked timbers and no drainage." Clara's throat tightened. She had not expected help. She had not expected anyone to look at her trench in the hillside and see anything but foolishness. "I cannot pay you," she said. "I did not ask for money. I asked to see your sight." He stood and brushed the dirt from his coat. "Tomorrow I will bring my odds and my level. We are going to sound every timber you have dragged up here, and the ones that do not rain are going back downhill." He walked east along the game trail, his mattock over his shoulder, and did not look back. Clara stood at the edge of her excavation and watched him go. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, and the shadows of the stumps stretched long across the cleared ground. Somewhere to the west, past the tree line, past the camp with its 36 wooden buildings and its slash piles and its shake roofs, dry lightning was flickering along the horizon like a pulse. She had 6 weeks, maybe less. She had a trench in a hill, a third of a perimeter ring, hands that bled when she closed them, and now, for the first time since the superintendent's bookkeeper had not read his folded note, she had someone who believed her. The timber was dry, the wind was building, and the clock she could not see was counting down to something that would test every cord of dirt, every sound beam, and every foot of cleared ground she could lay between herself and what was coming. Jonas Thorne arrived the next morning before the sun cleared the ridge. He carried his adze, a hand level made from a glass tube set in pine, and a canvas roll of chisels that looked older than Clara. He did not greet her. He walked to the pile of timbers she had dragged from the blow-down field and began knocking each one with the flat of the adze, listening. The first log rang clear. He set it aside. The second rang dull on the far end, and when he struck it again, the sound deadened like a hand pressed on a bell. "Rot pocket," he said, 3 feet in from the butt. You put this under load and it folds in 6 months. Sooner if heat dries it fast. He rejected 3 of the 8 timbers she had hauled. Clara watched the rejected logs roll downhill toward the brush line and felt the math tighten around her chest. 3 fewer beams meant 3 more to find, fell or retrieve, limb, bark, and drag. Each one cost a day she did not have. "You cannot build a roof you do not trust," Jonas said, reading her face. "A roof you do not trust is a roof you will not stay under when it matters." They worked the timber together that first week, and the difference was immediate. Jonas knew how to read grain direction by running a thumb along the bark seam. He knew which blowdown trees had been dead before they fell, useless, punky inside, and which had been green broken by wind and were still sound. He showed Clara how to score a felling notch on standing dead tamarack so the tree dropped where she needed it, instead of where gravity preferred. And he showed her how to split saplings for the cross lay by driving a wedge along the grain line instead of sawing, which was faster and wasted less wood. But Jonas did not do her work for her. He taught and then he watched, and when she made a mistake, he said so once and did not say it again. The relationship was not charity. It was the recognition of shared understanding between 2 people who thought about fire and earth in the same language, separated by 40 years of experience. By the end of June, the excavation was complete. 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, 6 feet down at the back wall. The mineral soil held its cut faces cleanly, pale as old bone, and the floor was level enough that a dropped marble would have rolled slowly rather than shot. Jonas had helped her cut the drainage swale above the rear wall, a shallow trench angled to shed water around both sides of the shelter, directing runoff away from the back face where saturation would be fatal. The swale took 2 days of digging through root-laced topsoil, but when Clara poured a bucket of water at the top and watched it run cleanly around the shelter without touching the back wall, those 2 days felt earned. The perimeter clearing continued in parallel. Clara worked the ring every morning before the heat peaked, then switched to shelter construction in the afternoon shade. By mid-July, the cleared zone had reached roughly 60 feet on the uphill side and 80 feet on the downhill face, where the slope helped and the brush was thinner. The remaining gaps troubled her. 40 feet of uncleared ground on the northwest quarter, where a dense patch of old slash from a skid road crossing resisted every tool she owned. The slash was half buried, bark-covered, tangled with wire cable left by the logging crews. She hacked at it in the evenings until her shoulders burned. One night Marta came up the trail after dark, carrying a bucket of water from the creek and a cloth bundle of corn dodgers she had baked on the cookhouse stove when no one was watching. She set them beside Clara's bedroll without ceremony. "You look thin," Marta said. "I am thin. You look like you're working yourself to death to avoid burning to death." Clara almost laughed. It was the first time in weeks that anything had been funny. "That is exactly what I am doing." Marta sat beside her in the dark. The stars were hard overhead, and the smell of dust and dry pine hung in the air like something solid. From below, the camp lanterns made a scatter of yellow dots in the black valley. "Havel is sick," Marta said. "Fever and chest. 3 days now. The camp has no doctor closer than Usk, and Pike will not release a wagon for a laundress's brother." Clara looked at her. "How sick?" "Sick enough that I am afraid to leave him and afraid to stay." This was not about fire or shelters or cleared ground. This was about a woman with a feverish boy and no one to turn to. Clara gave Marta the last of her willow bark tea, a remedy her mother had used on the Nebraska homestead, and told her to keep his water clean and his blankets off when the fever spiked. It was all she had. It was not enough. Marta left. Clara lay awake, listening to the silence where rain should have been. The roof went on in the third week of July, and it nearly killed the project. Jonas had selected 9 sound tamarack beams, each between 10 and 12 inches through, peeled and trimmed to length. Setting them was the hardest physical labor Clara had ever done. Each beam weighed more than she did. Jonas rigged a simple ramp, 2 skid poles greased with pine pitch, and they hauled the beams up the slope with rope and leverage, positioning each one across the excavation on 2-foot centers. The work required both of them pulling in coordination, and on the 4th beam, Clara's injured hand reopened. Blood ran down the rope. She wrapped it with a strip of petticoat and kept pulling. By the time the 9th beam was seated, they had spent 5 days on the main structure alone. The crosslay went faster. Split saplings laid perpendicular across the beams, lashed with stripped bark cordage at every junction. Then the brush mat, a thick layer of fir boughs, and salal pressed flat to create a barrier between the crosslay and the earth above. Then the clay. Jonas showed her the clay source, a cut bank along the creek a mile north, where gray-blue clay lay exposed beneath a shelf of gravel. They dug it in buckets and hauled it on a makeshift travois that Jonas built from 2 poles and a piece of canvas. The clay went on in layers, troweled into every gap between the brush mat and the timber, worked into the seams with bare hands until Clara's fingers were raw and gray to the wrists. Each layer had to dry before the next went on, and in the July heat the drying took hours rather than days, but those hours felt like years. The overburden was last. 3 feet of packed mineral soil and gravel on top of the clay layer, shoveled from the excavation spoil pile and from a borrow pit Jonas had identified 30 yards upslope. 3 feet does not sound like much. It is enormous when measured in shovelfuls carried by 2 people up a ramp to a roof and spread by hand. Clara counted. It took roughly 900 shovelfuls to cover the first third of the roof to depth. She stopped counting after that because the number was making her dizzy. Jonas packed each layer with the flat of his shovel and then with his boots, walking the roof surface in a slow grid pattern, compressing the soil until it would not give under his weight. "Loose dirt slides," he said. "Packed dirt stays, and packed dirt does not let embers in." They plastered the interior cracks on the last day of July. Clay and wood ash mixed to a thick paste, pressed into every joint between beam and wall, every seam where the crosslay met the excavation face, every gap around the ventilation pipe, a short length of stovepipe Clara had traded 2 days of mending work for at the camp blacksmith's shop. The rear vent was a simple hole through the back wall, lined with flat stones, positioned high enough to draw smoke upward and fitted with a plug of clay and wet cloth that could be sealed in seconds. Jonas inspected every inch. He ran his fingers along every plastered seam. He checked the drainage swale for blockage. He tested the front wall cribbing, flat basalt stones from his kiln site, stacked dry and chinked with clay by leaning his full weight against it. It held. "The structure is sound," he said. "The ring is not finished." He was right. The northwest gap still held 35 feet of uncleared slash, and Clara was running out of time in a way she could feel in her bones. The thunderheads that built over the ridges every afternoon were getting taller and darker, and the rain that fell from them evaporated before it touched the ground. She could see the verga, gray curtains of moisture hanging beneath the clouds, dissolving into nothing. The air that reached the valley floor was hot and electric and carried the smell of ozone without the relief of water. "Dry lightning," Jonas said one evening, watching the sky. "The worst kind. It starts fires and does not put them out." Boone appeared on the trail 2 days later. Clara had not seen the foreman since her expulsion, and his presence on the slope felt like a change in atmospheric pressure, something heavy entering the space. He stood at the edge of the cleared ring and looked at the shelter. The entrance was a low rectangle framed in timber and stone, set into the hillside so that from a distance the structure looked like nothing more than a scar in the earth. The roof was invisible, just bare dirt with a slight mound, indistinguishable from the hillside itself. Boone walked the ring in silence. He noted the stripped ground, the absence of brush, the bare mineral soil stretching in every direction from the entrance. "You did this," he said. Not a question. "Jonas Thorne helped with the roof timbers. The rest is mine." Boone looked at the shelter entrance again. His expression was not mockery. It was something closer to confusion, the look of a man encountering something that did not fit any category he owned. "It is a hole in the ground, Voss." "It is a hole in the ground with 3 feet of earth on the roof and 100 feet of bare dirt around it." "And you think that will stop a crown fire?" "I think a crown fire needs crowns. There are no crowns within 100 feet of where I sleep, and the fire cannot burn what is already dirt." Boone was quiet for a long time. He looked west, toward the ridges where the thunderheads built every afternoon. Then he looked back at Clara. "If you are wrong, you die in there. If I am right, I do not." He left without another word. But he left slowly, and twice he looked back at the cleared ring, and Clara saw something in his face that she had not seen before. Doubt. Not doubt about her. Doubt about himself. Silas Pike was not interested in doubt. He was interested in damage. On a night in early August, Clara woke to the sound of dragging. She came out of the shelter with her lantern and found 3 boys, camp roustabouts, 14 or 15 years old, scattering armloads of dry brush into the northwest section of her cleared ring. They had carried it up from the slash piles below and were throwing it in handfuls, laughing, filling the gap she had spent 3 days clearing. The boys ran when they saw her light. Clara stood in the dark, holding her lantern, looking at the brush scattered across 30 feet of ground she had stripped to bare dirt on her hands and knees. It would take her a full day to clear it again. A full day she did not have. She cleared it. She dragged every stick and bark slab back out of the ring and piled it beyond the perimeter. She finished at noon the next day, sunburned and shaking with fatigue, and then she walked the full ring one more time, checking every foot. The perimeter was not perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was close. 90 feet of bare ground on the tightest side, 110 on the widest. The shelter was sealed. The vents were functional. The drainage was clear. She had done what she could. Now the sky would decide. 2 unexpected allies appeared in those final days. A pair of shingle sawyers named Collis. The same young man from the creek and his partner Renfro approached Clara's camp one evening with 2 nail kegs and a coil of baling wire. They did not say Pike had sent them. They did not say they were worried about fire. They said they had heard she did laundry work, and they had shirts that needed mending, and they happened to have nails they did not need. Clara took the nails and the wire. She mended their shirts. Nothing more was said. But she used the nails to secure the front wall cribbing and the wire to lash the ventilation pipe. And when the shingle sawyers walked back down the trail, she noticed they took the long way around, the path that did not pass Pike's cabin. The shelter was complete enough to inhabit by the 2nd week of August. Clara began sleeping inside. The interior was dark, cool, and quiet in a way that reminded her of the Nebraska dugout so sharply it made her chest ache. The packed earth walls held the day's heat at a distance. At noon, when the camp cookhouse below reached temperatures that made the cooks curse and prop every door open, Clara's shelter stayed cool enough that she could press her palm to the rear wall and feel the earth's indifference to the sun. The floor was packed dirt, swept clean, covered near her sleeping area with the canvas tarp. Her lantern hung from a peg driven between 2 roof beams, and the light caught the clay-plastered seams and made them shine faintly like veins in stone. She tested the ventilation by building a small fire in a tin stove she had fashioned from a salvaged camp bucket. The smoke rose to the ceiling, found the rear vent, and drew upward through the stone-lined channel and out the back of the hill. The draw was steady in calm air. She tested it in wind by waiting for an afternoon gust and checking the rear vent again. The draw stuttered but held. She tested the emergency seal by plugging the rear vent with wet cloth and clay, leaving only the low front intake open. The air grew close within minutes but remained breathable. She could survive sealed for 2, perhaps 3 hours if she stayed flat on the floor where the air was coolest and least contaminated. The roof did not sag. Jonas had been right about the timber selection. The sound beams held the overburden without flexing, and the packed soil on top had consolidated into a dense, nearly monolithic cap that shed the occasional rain spatter like stone. From outside, the shelter was nearly invisible. A stranger walking the slope would see a low opening in the hill, a mound of bare earth above it, and a ring of stripped ground that looked like a natural clearing or an old burn scar. It did not look like a structure. That was the point. But the sky was not cooperating with calm assessment. Every day the thunderheads grew taller and the lightning grew closer. One afternoon, Clara counted 11 strikes on the ridgeline in a single hour. None of them brought rain. The forest floor crackled underfoot like old paper. The creek below camp had dropped so low that the water was barely ankle deep at the crossing, and the camp's water barrel, the one whose bottom ring showed because it had been dipped so low, had not been refilled in 2 days because the teamster who drove the water wagon said the creek source was failing. Jonas stopped visiting. He told Clara his lungs were bad and the climb was hard, but she suspected the real reason was simpler. He had taught her what he could, and the rest was between her and the fire. On his last visit, he walked the ring one final time, tested the front wall with his hand, and said, "A shelter is not a hole. It is a promise you keep before the weather asks." Clara memorized the sentence the way she had memorized her mother's words about fire and feeding. She did not know yet that it would be the last thing Jonas Thorne would teach her in person. The storm came on a Thursday in the 3rd week of August. It built all afternoon, a wall of cloud that rose from behind the western ridge like something climbing out of the earth. The base was black. The top was white and anvil-shaped, and so tall it seemed to lean over the valley. Lightning walked across the ridge in pulses, and the thunder followed in rolling waves that shook the air without moving it. No rain fell. The wind came instead, hot, dry gusts that bent the standing timber on the upper slopes and sent old needles streaming horizontally through the camp like brown snow. Clara was on the cleared ring when she saw the first strike hit timber on the ridge. A standing fir caught the bolt and exploded into a torch, orange and vertical against the black sky. She watched it for 3 seconds. Then she went inside the shelter and began wetting every piece of cloth she owned. By dusk, men on the spar tree line above camp reported smoke to the west. Not close, not distant. The kind of smoke that could mean a single snag burning itself out or the beginning of something that would not stop. Boone sent a crew of 4 to investigate. They came back in 2 hours with ash on their hats and a report that made the camp go quiet. The fire was in heavy slash on a westward slope, moving east with the wind, and it was not one fire. It was 3. The lightning had touched down in a line across the ridge, and each strike had found fuel. Clara spent that night inside the shelter with the lantern lit, listening. The wind did not die at sunset the way it usually did. It held steady and warm from the west, carrying the smell of smoke that was not camp smoke. It was forest smoke, resinous, thick, slightly sweet, the smell of living wood being cooked faster than it could shed moisture. At dawn, the smoke was visible as a brown haze across the upper valley. The sun rose red. Ash began to fall, not thick, not yet, just a few gray flakes drifting down like the world's most terrifying snow. Clara packed her water bucket, soaked 3 blankets, checked her vent seals, and waited. Camp was not waiting. Camp was arguing. Boone wanted to cut a fire line along the east side of the settlement. Pike wanted to continue production and send a rider to Usk for a fire crew. The Sawyers wanted to run. No one could agree because no one knew how fast the fire was moving or exactly where it was. The smoke erased the ridgeline. The sky was a featureless brown-orange ceiling that gave no direction and no distance. By mid-morning, the wind shifted. It came harder from the northwest, and with it came embers. The first embers were small, no bigger than fingernails, drifting in on the wind like burning insects. They landed on the camp's shake roofs and in the slash piles and on the bark stacks beside the mill. Most went out on contact. Some did not. A Sawyer spotted smoke curling from a bark pile between the bunkhouses and threw a bucket of water on it. Another ember caught in the dry moss on the cookhouse roof. Someone climbed up and stamped it out, but the embers kept coming, and there were more of them with each gust, and the men who were stamping and bucketing were losing ground the way a man with a tin cup loses ground against a rising creek. Clara watched from the edge of her cleared ring. She could see the camp below, see the men running between buildings, see the smoke rising from 6 spots where embers had found fuel. She wanted to go down. She wanted to help. But she knew with a certainty that sat in her stomach like a stone that going down meant dying down there. The camp was fuel. Every board, every shake, every pile of slash and bark was an invitation, and the fire was coming to accept. That was when Marta appeared on the trail. She was carrying Pavel on her back. The boy was 14 but thin from fever, and Marta had him in a blanket sling, his arms around her neck, his head lolling against her shoulder. She was running. Not the steady run of someone covering distance, the lurching, uneven run of someone fleeing something they have just seen. "The west bunkhouses are burning," Marta gasped. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the cleared ring. Pavel slid off her back and lay on the bare dirt, breathing in shallow pulls. 3 buildings. The slash caught between them, and now they cannot stop it. Boone is pulling men back to the creek. Clara looked at Pavel. His face was gray and wet. His chest rose and fell too fast. Taking him into the shelter meant 3 people sharing air that was designed for one. It meant more heat, more moisture, more panic. It meant risking everything she had built on 2 extra bodies in a space that might not have enough oxygen for one. She did not hesitate. She picked up Pavel's feet, and Marta took his shoulders, and they carried him through the low entrance into the dark. Inside the shelter, the sound of the fire was muffled but not absent. Clara could hear the wind above the roof, a sustained roar that rose and fell in waves like surf heard from underwater. Through the low entrance, she could see the sky changing color, brown to orange, orange to a deep, violent amber that pulsed with light. She sealed the rear vent first. Wet cloth pressed into the stone-lined channel, packed tight with clay she had kept moist in a covered bucket for exactly this purpose. She left the front intake open, a 6-inch pipe angled downward and screened with doubled cloth, positioned low to the ground where the air would be coolest and least smoke-laden. She soaked all 3 blankets and draped one over the entrance opening, leaving only the bottom 6 inches clear for airflow. "Get flat," she told Marta. "On the floor, get Pavel flat. The good air is at the bottom." Marta pulled Pavel down. He moaned but did not resist. Clara lay beside them and pressed her cheek to the packed earth floor. The dirt was cool. Not comfortable, hard, and gritty against her skin, but cool, and in the next hour that coolness would become the most valuable thing any of them possessed. The fire announced itself before it arrived. The ashfall thickened from a drift to a downpour. Gray flakes the size of coins came through the entrance gap and settled on the wet blankets, hissing faintly. The light outside shifted from amber to a flickering orange that threw moving shadows across the shelter walls. Clara could smell the fire now, not the clean wood smoke of a campfire, but the heavy, oily stench of resin and sap and green wood being cooked alive, a smell so thick it had weight. Then the sound changed. The wind roar rose in pitch and volume until it was not wind anymore. It was something between a freight train and a waterfall, a sustained physical assault of noise that pressed against the shelter walls like a hand pushing inward. The earth around them vibrated. The roof beams creaked, and for one terrible second Clara heard a sound like a knuckle cracking, and she did not know if it was a timber shifting under the heat load or the beginning of a collapse. The beam held. She pressed her ear to the floor and listened to the earth, and the earth told her what she needed to know. The packed overburden was doing its work. 3 feet of mineral soil was absorbing the radiant heat from above and dissipating it downward through mass, the way a stone wall absorbs the sun's warmth and releases it slowly instead of all at once. The fire could not burn the roof because the roof was not a roof. It was ground. The fire was walking on top of her shelter the way it walked on any bare hillside, and it was finding nothing to seize. But the front wall was another matter. Clara saw the glow before she felt the heat. The entrance opening blazed orange through the wet blanket. The blanket began to steam. She could feel the temperature rising against her face even from the floor, and when she crawled forward and pressed her hand to the front wall cribbing, the basalt stones chinked with clay. The stone was warm, not hot enough to burn. Not yet, but warm enough that she could feel the fire sitting out there, beyond the cleared ring, radiating its heat across the bare ground toward the only exposed surface of her shelter. This was the moment the 100-foot ring earned its existence. If burning slash had been piled against the front wall, if the boys' pike scent had scattered brush that Clara had not cleared, the flame would have been sitting against the stone instead of radiating from a distance. The heat at the entrance would have been lethal, not merely terrifying. The wet blanket would have ignited instead of steaming. The air inside would have cooked instead of thickening. But the ring was clear. The fire had found nothing to burn within 90 feet of the entrance on its nearest side. The radiant heat from the main front was ferocious but brief. A fire that has no fuel beneath it passes faster than a fire that does. And the embers that landed on the cleared ring found bare mineral dirt and expired the way the lightning-struck snag had expired on the bare ground 2 months earlier. They had nothing to catch, nothing to climb into, nothing to feed. Inside the shelter, Clara counted breaths. Not out of panic, out of management. She counted her own breathing, in for 4, hold for 2, out for 4. She counted Marta's breathing, which was fast and shallow. She counted Pavel's breathing, which was too fast and punctuated with small coughs that sounded like tearing cloth. "Slower," she told Marta. "Breathe slower. The air is thin, but it is here. If we breathe slow, we use less." Marta pressed her face to the dirt floor. Her hand found Clara's in the dark and gripped it. "How long?" "The front passes. It does not stay. If nothing near us is burning, the heat will drop." "How long?" "I do not know." The roar continued. The light through the entrance shifted from orange to white, which was worse because white meant the temperature outside had climbed past the point where color had meaning. The timber beams above them groaned, not the sharp crack of failure, a slow, deep sound like a ship settling in heavy water. The overburden was pressing down, and the heat was pressing up, and the beams were caught between, doing the work they had been chosen to do. If you are holding your breath right now, stay with us, because in the next minutes, everything Clara Voss built is either going to save 3 lives or bury them. Pavel began to cough harder. Marta pulled him close and pressed his face against her shirt, filtering the air through cotton. Clara crawled to the front wall and checked the intake pipe. Smoke was seeping around the cloth screen, not pouring, but threading in through the weave in thin gray ribbons. She re-wet the screen from her water bucket, squeezing water through the cloth until it dripped. The smoke ribbons thinned. She pressed her hand to the floor. Still cool. She pressed it to the rear wall. Cool. She pressed it to a roof beam directly above her head and pulled her hand back. It was warm, noticeably warm. The heat of the fire above transmitted through 3 feet of earth and into the timber. But it was not hot. It was not the searing contact heat that would mean the overburden had failed. It was the deep, slow warmth of conduction through mass, the heat arriving late and diminished, the way her mother's dugout wall had been barely warm while the grass fire raged above. Time became elastic. Clara did not know if the peak lasted 20 minutes or an hour. She knew the moment it broke because the light at the entrance shifted. The white glare faded back to orange, and the orange faded to a dull, pulsing red, and the roar, the terrible, sustained roar that had pressed against the walls like a living thing, began to drop in pitch. Lower, slower. The freight train was moving away. The fire front was passing east, chasing its own wind, looking for fuel that was not here. The heat at the front wall peaked and then began to recede. Clara pressed her hand to the basalt cribbing again. The stone was hot now, the lag of conduction, but the heat was not increasing. It was an echo. The fire had moved on and left its warmth behind like a footprint. She waited another hour. She waited because the first rule of fire survival, the rule her mother had taught her by demonstration in a Nebraska grass fire 20 years earlier, was that the front is not the end. Embers fall behind the front. Spot fires start in places the main fire missed. A standing snag can burn for hours and drop burning material into clear ground. Opening the door too early meant walking into a landscape that was still trying to kill you. When she finally pulled the wet blanket aside and looked out, the world was gray. Not the gray of dawn or cloud cover. The gray of ash. It lay on everything. The bare ground of the ring, the stumps beyond the perimeter, the standing timber that was no longer standing. Every tree she could see was either burning, had burned, or was a blackened post trailing smoke into an orange-brown sky. The camp below was invisible behind a curtain of smoke, but she could see the glow. Multiple glows. Structures burning at different rates, at different stages, some collapsing inward with showers of sparks, and some still standing with flame crawling their walls like something searching for the last thing it had not consumed. The shelter stood. The front wall cribbing was scorched dark. The entrance timbers were discolored. But the structure was intact. The roof was intact. The mound of earth above was exactly as she had left it, packed, dense, undisturbed. She pressed her hand to the top of the entrance frame. Warm, not hot. She pressed her hand to the dirt beside the entrance. Warm, not hot. Behind her, Pavel coughed. Marta was sitting up, blinking in the gray light, her face streaked with dirt and tears and ash. "Is it over?" Marta asked. Clara looked at the smoking landscape. She looked at the camp below, where the shapes of buildings were wrong, collapsed, shortened, missing walls, missing roofs, some reduced to chimney columns standing alone in fields of ember. She looked at the cleared ring, where the bare dirt lay undisturbed except for a scatter of ash and a few charred sticks that had blown in from beyond the perimeter and died on contact. "The front is over," Clara said. "The rest is just beginning." A man appeared at the edge of the cleared ring. He came from below, from the direction of camp, stumbling uphill through the smoking ground. His shirt was burned through at the shoulder. His beard was singed on one side. His hands were black. He reached the bare dirt of the perimeter and stopped, looking at the shelter entrance, looking at Clara standing in front of it, looking at the unburned hillside behind her, with an expression that was not gratitude or relief or anger. It was incomprehension. He could not understand how anything was still standing. Behind him, another figure emerged from the smoke, then another, then a woman carrying a child. They came up the hill because there was nowhere else to go. The camp was burning. The creek was choked with fallen timber and ash. The road out of the valley was blocked by fire on both sides. The only clear ground in the drainage, the only ground where embers died on contact and flame had found nothing to feed, was the ring Clara Voss had stripped to mineral soil on her hands and knees over 6 weeks of work that everyone in camp had called foolishness. They gathered on the bare dirt like survivors on a raft. 8 people, then 12, then 15. Some burned, some coughing. One man, a choker setter named Drent, had not made it past the slash edge on the east side of camp. They found out later. His boots had melted into the ground. Boone was among the last to arrive. His left arm was wrapped in a wet rag that was no longer wet. His face was the color of old paper. He stood at the edge of the cleared ring and looked at the shelter, the low entrance, the invisible roof, the unbroken mound of earth, and then he looked at Clara. "I told you dirt was no house," he said. His voice was hoarse, stripped by smoke. "I was wrong. It is the only one left." Clara did not answer. She was already moving, pulling blankets from the shelter for the burned man, directing Marta to the water bucket, checking Pavel's breathing, counting the people on the ring and calculating what she had and what they needed. Shelter. Water. Shade from the embers still falling. A triage point for the burned and the smoke sick and the man whose arm had stopped being an arm and had become a problem. The hill was still smoking, the camp below was ash, and the woman they had laughed at, the woman who had been building herself a grave with a door, was the only person in the valley with a roof that was still a roof and ground that was still safe to stand on. The first night after the fire, 15 people slept on the bare ground of Clara's cleared ring. The shelter held 3 Pavel on the floor inside, Marta beside him, and the man with the burned arm, whose name was Galt, and whose arm needed more than Clara could give. The rest lay in the open, wrapped in whatever they had carried out of camp, breathing air that tasted of char, and watching embers drift across the sky like orange stars falling sideways. Clara did not sleep. She walked the perimeter until dawn, stamping out the embers that landed inside the ring and checking the shelter entrance for smoke intrusion. By morning, her boots were gray to the ankle, and her eyes burned from ash. The second day brought clarity in the worst possible form. The fire had moved east through the drainage and was burning itself out against a rock slide on the far ridge. Behind it, the camp lay in ruin. The men who went down to look came back with numbers that made the scope of the loss physical. 29 of 36 structures destroyed or too damaged to inhabit. The mill shed, the drying house, the cookhouse, and all but 2 bunkhouses gone. The camp store stood because it had a tin roof and a gravel apron on 2 sides, which had kept flame contact brief enough that the walls survived. The blacksmith shop stood because it was stone below the roof line. Everything else was ash, charred framing, or smoking wreckage that could not be entered. The shelter was not just standing, it was functional. The interior was habitable, cool, dry, structurally intact. The roof had not moved. The ventilation drew cleanly once Clara unplugged the rear vent. The water bucket inside was still half full. The food she had stored, flour, dried beans, salt, a tin of lard, was untouched. In a valley where every other food store had burned, Clara's provisions became the only certain supply within walking distance. Boone came to the shelter on the third morning. His burned arm was wrapped in fresh cloth that Marta had torn from her own underskirt, and his face had aged 10 years in 48 hours. He did not come to apologize. Boone was not a man who apologized. He came because he needed information, and Clara was the only person who had it. He stood at the entrance and looked at the interior, the packed walls, the beam ceiling, the clay-sealed joints, the ventilation pipe, the stored supplies. He ran his good hand along the front wall cribbing, feeling the basalt stones that were still faintly warm from the fire's radiant heat 2 days earlier. "How wide is the cleared ring?" he asked. 90 feet at the narrowest, 110 at the widest. "How deep is the dirt on the roof?" 3 feet. Packed mineral soil over a clay layer, over a brush mat, over cross-laid saplings, over tamarack beams on 2-foot centers. Boone processed this the way he processed timber estimates, methodically, converting each detail into a picture he could use. "You said the fire could not burn what was already dirt. I heard you say it, and I thought you were talking nonsense." "I was talking about physics, Mr. Boone. Dirt does not ignite. If the fire has nothing to catch within 100 feet, it passes. The heat radiates, but it does not accumulate. The shelter absorbs what reaches it, and the mass dissipates the rest." "And the air?" "The front intake stayed clear because it was low and screened. Smoke rises. The cleanest air in a fire is at ground level, and the intake drew from there. I sealed the rear vent and left only the low pipe open. We breathed thin air for maybe 2 hours. It was enough." Boone looked at her. The dismissal was gone from his face. So was the confusion from his last visit. What remained was something harder to carry, the recognition that he had been wrong in a way that cost lives. Drent was dead. 2 other men were burned badly enough that they might not recover without a doctor. The camp was destroyed. And the one person who had seen it coming, who had built for it, who had offered a model that could have saved the settlement, that person had been fired for talking. "If I had listened to you," Boone said. He stopped. He started again. "If I had cleared the slash around camp the way you cleared this hill—" "You would have needed 20 men for a week," Clara said, "and Pike would have fought you every day of it." "Pike?" Boone said the name the way a man says the name of a sickness he has finally diagnosed. "Pike is down at the store ledgering what he can salvage. The camp is ash, and he's counting board feet." Clara did not respond to that. She had work to do. The survivors needed shade. The August sun on ash-covered ground was brutal, and they needed water, and they needed someone to organize them before shock turned to panic. She had already marked out a second cleared area downhill from the shelter where a tarp shelter could be rigged between standing snags. She had already sent Collis and Renfro to the creek to check if the water was still drinkable or if ash runoff had fouled it. Boone watched her directing people. He watched the way they listened to her, not because she shouted or commanded, but because she was the only person who had known what to do before the fire and clearly knew what to do after it. Authority had shifted. It had not been given or taken. It had simply moved to the person who had earned it. Marta's conversion was quieter and more complete. She did not need to be persuaded by evidence. She had lain on the floor of the shelter with her sick brother while fire roared overhead and the roof held. The evidence had pressed against her face for 2 hours. On the 4th day after the fire, Marta walked the cleared ring with Clara the way Jonas had walked it, slowly, looking at the ground, testing the perimeter edge where blackened earth met bare mineral soil. The line was sharp. On one side, everything was burned. On the other, nothing. The contrast was so clean, it looked like someone had drawn a boundary with a straight edge. "I told you the roof would collapse," Marta said. "You did." "I told you you would suffocate." "You did." Marta knelt and picked up a handful of the bare dirt from inside the ring. She let it fall through her fingers. "How many people could a shelter like this hold?" "The size I built? 3, maybe 4 in an emergency. If you made it wider, 16 by 20, you could hold 6. But the ring matters more than the shelter. A family could survive in a shallow trench with a wet blanket if the ring was wide enough and clean enough." "Pavel is breathing better today." "Good." "He is breathing better because you let him in." Clara looked at Marta. The laundress's face was still streaked with ash in the lines around her eyes, and her hands were raw from carrying water and tearing cloth for bandages. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the fire. "You would have done the same," Clara said. "I would not have had a shelter to let anyone into. That is the difference." They stood on the cleared ring, looking down at the ruined camp, and neither of them said anything else for a while. The smoke had thinned enough that the valley was visible again, the creek winding through charred timber, the dark rectangles where buildings had been, the tin roof of the camp store glinting in the sun like a coin in a pile of soot. Within the first week, the questions started. Men who had barely spoken to Clara before the fire now climbed the hill to look at the shelter and the ring and to ask specific things. How deep was the excavation? What kind of timber did she use for the beams? How did she know to clear 100 feet instead of 50? Could a man build one of these on a flat site without a hill to cut into? Clara answered every question. She did not hoard the method. She walked each person through the logic the way Jonas had walked her through the drainage swale, patiently, specifically, with exact numbers and no romanticism. She drew profiles in the ash with a stick, showing the cross-section of the roof. Beams, saplings, brush mat, clay, overburden. She paced out the cleared ring and explained why 90 feet was the minimum and why 100 was better and why anything less than 70 was gambling with the math. She made them measure. She handed them the rope she had used to stake her own perimeter and told them to pace it out on their own sites and see how much ground they would need to clear. Most of them looked at the rope's length and went quiet. 100 feet in every direction was a circle 200 feet across. That was more ground than most people had ever cleared for anything. The scale of the work was the hardest thing to accept. A sawyer named Phelan asked the question everyone was thinking. Why 100 feet? Why not 60 or 80? Because at 60 feet, radiant heat from a fully involved tree can still ignite dry siding. At 80, it can still blister exposed timber. At 100, the heat drops enough that a non-combustible surface, earth, stone, packed dirt, can absorb it without reaching ignition temperature. The fire cannot jump what it cannot heat. How do you know that? I watched a lightning-struck snag burn on bare dirt 2 months ago. The fire went nowhere. It had no fuel to climb into, and the ground absorbed the heat. The cleared ring does the same thing on a larger scale. Phelan was quiet. Then he said, I need to rebuild. My wife is coming from Spokane. Then clear first, build second, and do not build with exposed shake. If you must use wood for the roof, cover it. Silas Pike's reaction to the fire and its aftermath was not conversion. It was calculation. Pike had survived by running. He had not gone to the creek, which choked with ash and fallen timber. He had not gone uphill to Clara's ring, which he had publicly mocked for 2 months. He had gone east on the wagon road, outrunning the fire's flank by a margin so thin that the back of his coat was scorched, and his horse had burns on its hindquarters. He returned the next day with a company ledger under his arm and began cataloging losses as if the fire had been a business transaction that needed reconciling. He did not visit the shelter. He did not ask Clara anything. He set up a table in the surviving camp store and began tallying board feet of salvageable timber, estimating reconstruction costs, and sending riders to Usk with messages for the company office. The camp would rebuild. It would rebuild quickly, cheaply, and in the same configuration as before, because Pike's job was to restore production, not to rethink the settlement. Clara heard about Pike's plans from Collis, who had been drafted into the salvage crew. "He wants the new bunkhouses up before September," Collis said. "Same spacing, same shake roofs, same slash piles." "Same result," Clara said. "He says the fire was a 100-year event. He says it will not happen again in any of our lifetimes." Clara looked at the boy. He was 19, sunburned, earnest. He had carried nail kegs up the hill in secret, and he had checked the creek for drinkable water without being asked, and he was the closest thing she had to a convert who might actually build differently. "The fire was not a 100-year event," Clara said. "It was a dry summer event. The lightning will come again next August, and the August after that. The question is not whether it will happen again. The question is what you're standing next to when it does." Jonas Thorne came back to the shelter site 9 days after the fire. Clara had not seen him since his last visit before the crisis, and when he appeared on the game trail, she felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. He was thinner. His breathing was audible from 10 paces, a wet rattling sound that came from deep in his chest and did not clear when he coughed. But his eyes were sharp and his hands were steady, and when he saw the shelter standing intact with the cleared ring unbroken around it, he stopped on the trail and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You kept your promise," he said. "The weather asked," Clara said. "The shelter answered." They walked the site together. Jonas inspected the fire damage at the perimeter edge, the sharp line between burned ground and bare mineral soil, the scorched front wall cribbing, the intact roof mound. He checked the drainage swale, which had carried ash-laden runoff around the shelter during the brief rains that followed the fire. He tapped the roof beams from inside and listened. Everyone rang clear. No settlement, no rot, no heat damage to the grain. He sounded almost surprised. The overburden did its work. The overburden and the ring. Without the ring, the front wall would have caught. Without the ring, nothing else matters. Jonas sat on the floor of the shelter and coughed into his sleeve. The cough lasted too long. When he looked up, his lips were pale. The ring is the lesson. Everything else is engineering. The ring is philosophy. This was the closest they ever came to disagreement. Clara believed the shelter mattered as much as the ring, that the buried roof was not just protection, but proof, a demonstration that earth could replace wood as the primary barrier between a family and fire. Jonas believed the ring was the only thing that needed teaching, that the shelter design could vary endlessly, but the principle of fuel removal was universal. "You can build any shape you want," Jonas said. "You can dig or not dig. You can use timber or stone or sod. But if you do not clear the ground around it, the best built shelter in the world is just a target. And if you clear the ground but do not build shelter, people have nowhere to go when the embers fly. Then they lie flat in the bare dirt and cover their faces. Like animals. Better an animal on bare ground than a Christian in a burning house." Clara did not concede the point, but she understood what Jonas was trying to protect. He had watched timber camps and mining settlements burn because people trusted their buildings instead of their ground. He had seen fireproof ambition defeated by a single unmaintained clearance. The ring was his theology, and he was not wrong that it was the most transferable, most universally applicable piece of what Clara had built. Any family could clear ground. Not every family could build a buried shelter. They worked together through September and into October, teaching the survivors who stayed. Jonas corrected technique, how to cut a drainage swale at the right grade, how to select cribbing stone, how to pack clay into a joint so it would not crack when it dried. Clara led design, where to site a shelter on a slope, how to orient the entrance away from prevailing wind, how to calculate the overburden depth based on available timber diameter. Their partnership was visible to everyone in the valley. The old man with the bad lungs and the steady hands, the young woman with the cracked palms and the unshakable conviction that dirt was stronger than wood. One afternoon in late September, they walked Phelan's new cabin site together. Phelan had chosen a bench on the east side of the valley above the flood line, with a gentle slope and decent soil. Clara paced the perimeter while Jonas tested the ground with his mattock, scraping to mineral soil in 3 spots to check depth and texture. "The soil here is looser than mine," Clara said. "More sand in the mix. A full buried roof would need wider beams to carry the overburden without sagging." "Or a shallower overburden," Jonas said. 2 feet instead of 3. With a 100-foot ring on sand soil, 2 feet may be enough. The fire will not sit long enough to test the difference." Phelan listened, standing between them with a rope in his hands and the expression of a man trying to learn a language by listening to 2 people argue in it. "Which is it? 2 feet or 3? 3 if you can support it," Clara said. 2 if you cannot. The ring is what saves you. The roof is what keeps you comfortable while the ring does its work." Jonas glanced at her. A small motion, the corner of his mouth lifting, barely visible beneath the white beard. It was the closest she ever saw him come to acknowledging that she had absorbed his philosophy and made it part of her own. Jonas died in January. The lung illness he had carried for years, miner's cough, some called it, though Jonas had never mined. Charcoal burning produced its own kind of dust. Took him during a cold snap when the temperature dropped and the air turned sharp, and his chest could not keep up. Clara learned about it from a rider who came through 2 days later. Jonas had died in his shack near the spring, alone, with his mattock leaning against the wall and his chisels rolled in their canvas on the table. Clara walked the 2 miles to his shack in the snow. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room where a man had lived who understood soil and heat and the weight of packed earth better than anyone she had ever known. The stove was cold. The glass tube level sat on a shelf beside a tin cup. The mattock leaned where the rider had described it, angled against the wall as if Jonas had set it down expecting to pick it up again. She took the level and the chisels. She left everything else. On the walk back, the snow fell in large, slow flakes that landed on her shoulders and did not melt immediately, and the valley was so quiet she could hear the individual flakes touching the ground. Jonas had taught her to sound timber, to read drainage, to plaster cracks so tight that a blade of grass could not pass. He had taught her that a shelter was a promise. He had not taught her how to keep building without him, because he had believed she already knew. She did, but knowing and feeling ready were different things, and that winter Clara Voss felt the difference every day. The first time she sounded a timber without Jonas, she stood in the snow beside a fallen tamarack and knocked the butt end with the flat of her axe. The ring was clear. She knew it was clear. But the absence of Jonas's confirming nod, the slight tilt of his head that meant sound, proceed, made the clear ring feel provisional, unverified, as if her own ears could not be trusted without his. She drove the feeling down the way she drove fence posts, with repetition and force. She sounded the next timber, and the next. By the 4th, she could hear them without hearing his silence beside her. and that was enough. Spring came wet, and then it stopped. By June, the pattern was familiar. Warm days, dry air, thunderheads building over the ridges with less and less rain beneath them. The rebuilt camp had gone up fast under Pike's direction. New bunkhouses, new mill shed, new drying house, shake roofs, board siding. Slash piled in the same casual drifts as before, because clearing Slash cost time and time cost board feet, and board feet were Pike's religion. But not everyone had rebuilt Pike's way. Phelan, the sawyer whose wife had come from Spokane, had cleared a 70-foot ring around his new cabin site before driving a single nail. Collis and Renfro had built a shared cabin with a sod-covered roof and a 50-foot clearance. 3 other families on nearby claims had visited Clara's shelter, asked questions, measured rope lengths, and gone home to strip brush before building. The method was spreading, not fast, not universally, but in the specific, practical way that useful knowledge moves through a community of people who have watched their neighbors' houses burn. Clara had improved the original shelter through the winter. She added a separate ash pit and cook shelter downwind, built with stone and covered with a sod roof. She lined the entry trench with flat basalt from Jonas's kiln site, creating a non-combustible apron immediately around the entrance. She widened the drainage swale and reinforced it with cobblestones. She built a second chamber, smaller, 4 by 8 feet, connected to the main shelter by a low passage, intended as a food storage alcove that would stay cool year-round. The shelter was no longer a survival structure. It was a home, a strange home, invisible from 20 paces, smelling of clay and earth and lamp oil, but a home where Clara could stand upright in the center, cook on a small stove, read by lantern light, and sleep knowing that the ground above her was the strongest roof in the valley. The secondary crisis came in July, and it came not for Clara, but for a woman named Dagny Lund. Dagny was a widow with 2 children, a girl of 7 and a boy of 4, living on a claim 3 miles south, at the edge of the timber near a grass and brush flat that ran along the river bottom. Her husband had died of a falling tree accident the previous autumn, and she had stayed on the claim because the filing was in both their names, and leaving meant losing the only asset she had. She had no cleared ground around her cabin. She had no buried roof. She had a board and batten house with a shake roof, and a yard full of dry grass that ran right up to the front door. The fire started on a Wednesday from an unattended campfire at a prospector's camp upriver. The wind carried it south through the grass and brush at a speed that turned a distant column of smoke into a visible wall of flame in less than an hour. A rider reached Clara's shelter at midday with the news. The fire was moving toward Dagny Lund's claim, and Dagny had not been seen on the road. Clara did not hesitate. She gathered tools, the grub hoe, the shovel, the broad axe, and walked 3 miles south at a pace that left her soaked with sweat and breathing hard by the time she reached Dagny's claim. The smoke was visible above the tree line to the north. She had maybe 3 hours. Dagny was in her yard with the children, frozen in the particular paralysis of a person who has too many things to save and not enough time to save any of them. She had a bucket of water and a rake, and the expression of someone who knows the bucket and the rake are not enough. "You cannot save the cabin," Clara said. It was the first thing she said, not a greeting, not reassurance. The truth, delivered flat, because Dagny needed the truth more than she needed comfort. "What do I do?" "You dig." Clara paced out a ring. Not 100 feet. There was no time for 100 feet. 50 feet. A compromise that made her stomach tight, but 50 feet of cleared ground was infinitely better than none. She marked the perimeter with boot heels in the dirt and handed Dagny the grub hoe. "Everything inside this line comes out. Grass, brush, deadfall, everything. Down to bare dirt. Start at the cabin wall and work outward." "That is my garden. That is..." Your garden will not save your children. Bare dirt will. Start cutting. They worked in a fury that Clara had never matched, not even during the worst days of her own construction. Dagny swung the grub hoe with the desperation of a mother who has been told the only thing between her children and the fire is the dirt under the grass. Clara used the broad axe on brush and the shovel on sod, peeling the ground cover back in strips and dragging it beyond the perimeter. The 7-year-old girl carried armloads of pulled grass to the pile. The 4-year-old boy sat in the bare dirt near the cabin wall and watched with eyes that did not blink. If this story reminds you that preparation is not paranoia, that knowing what to do before the emergency arrives is the difference between a woman with a plan and a woman with a bucket, share it with someone who needs to hear it. They cleared 30 feet in 2 hours, not 50, 30. The grass was thick and the roots were deep, and 2 women with hand tools could not strip an acre of ground in an afternoon. Clara looked at the smoke column, which was closer and darker, and made a decision. We wet the cabin walls. Every bucket you have. Soak the shake roof. Then we get inside and we get low. Inside the house? The house will not burn if the ground around it is clear enough to keep the flames back. 30 feet is not enough for a crown fire, but this is a grass fire. Grass burns fast and moves fast and does not throw the same heat. If the walls are wet and the nearest fuel is 30 feet away, we may hold. It was not the certainty she had felt in her own shelter. It was a gamble, calculated on shorter flame lengths and faster fire passage in grass versus timber. But it was better than running with 2 small children in smoke, and it was better than standing in the yard with a bucket while the fire walked in. They soaked the walls. They soaked the roof. They poured water on the ground immediately around the foundation until the dirt was dark. Then they went inside, and Clara pulled the children under the table and told Dagny to lie flat and breathe slow and wait. The fire reached the claim 40 minutes later. Through the window, Clara watched the grass outside the cleared ring ignite in a running wave that moved faster than a man could walk. The heat reached the cabin as a sudden pressure change, the air thickening, the temperature spiking, the window glass almost too bright to face. Embers hit the wet shake roof and hissed. Smoke curled under the door, and Clara stuffed it with a wet rag. The little boy pressed against her side and did not cry. The grass fire passed in 11 minutes. The crown fire in the timber beyond Dagny's claim took longer. Clara could hear the deeper roar of heavy fuel catching, but the cabin sat at the grass edge, and the grass was what had threatened it. The 30-foot ring held. Not perfectly, a patch of uncleared brush on the north side scorched the cabin's corner boards, and the heat cracked one window pane, but the walls did not ignite. The wet shake roof did not catch. The ground around the foundation did not carry flame to the structure. When they came outside, the cleared ring was black at the edges and bare in the center. The grass beyond was ash. Dagny's cabin stood, smoke-stained and blistered on the north corner, but standing. Dagny stood in the doorway, holding the 4-year-old, and looking at the bare ground that had saved her house with an expression Clara recognized, because it was the same expression Boone had worn on the hill above camp. "How did you know?" Dagny asked. "My mother taught me. A man named Jonas showed me the rest, and the fire taught me what they could not, that the ground between you and the flame is the only thing that matters." Dagny looked at the 30-foot ring. "I need to make it wider." "Yes," Clara said. "You do." Pike learned about the Lund claim fire the way Pike learned about everything, through its effect on production. 2 of his salvage crew had left to help with the fire, and a teamster had diverted his wagon to carry water. Pike rode out to the claim the next day, saw the standing cabin, saw the cleared ring, and said to the teamster beside him, "Luck, the wind shifted." The teamster, who had seen the ring, said nothing, But Pike's dismissal was getting harder to maintain. The evidence was accumulating in the landscape itself. Clara's shelter stood untouched on its hill. 3 cabins built with clearance had survived the original fire with minimal damage. Dagny's cabin had survived a grass fire with a 30-foot ring cut in 2 hours. And the rebuilt camp, Pike's camp, with its shake roofs and its slash piles, was sitting in the same configuration that had burned once already, waiting for the next dry summer to prove the lesson again. Clara did not confront Pike directly. She did not need to. She taught anyone who came to her, and more were coming. By the end of that second summer, she had walked 7 different claim sites, advised on shelter placement and ring width, and helped 3 families calculate overburden depth for buried roofs. She carried Jonas's glass tube level in her pack the way Jonas had carried his mattock, as both tool and inheritance. The people who built her way did not build identically. Some dug full shelters. Some built conventional cabins with wide clearances and sawed roofs. Some simply cleared the 100-foot ring and left their wooden houses inside it, gambling that the clearance alone would protect conventional construction. Clara accepted all of it. The buried shelter was her answer. The cleared ring was Jonas's answer. Both were right, and both were better than what Pike was building. The hostile skeptic's arc was not finished, but his ground was shrinking with every fire season, and Clara Voss was not the woman digging a hole in the hill anymore. She was the woman people walked 3 miles to ask about dirt. By the second autumn after the fire, Clara Voss had become a fixed point in the valley's geography. Not a landmark because her home was nearly invisible, but a reference. When new families arrived on claims near the Pont d'Oreille drainage, someone would say, "Talk to Clara Voss before you build." When a family filed on a timbered slope, someone would say, "Have the Voss woman walk the site first." She had not asked for the authority. She had not named herself anything. The authority had grown the way her cleared ring had grown, 1 stripped foot of ground at a time, until the circle was large enough that people could stand inside it and feel the difference. A typical visit went like this. A man or a woman, sometimes both, would climb the hill to Clara's shelter on a Tuesday or Thursday, which were the days she was most likely to be home rather than walking someone else's claim. They would find her outside, usually, working the perimeter. The ring required maintenance. Fireweed grew back. Salal sent runners into the bare ground from the edges. Pine seedlings sprouted from windblown seeds and had to be pulled before they rooted. Clara walked the ring every week the way a farmer walks fence line, looking for breaches, pulling what did not belong, keeping the contract between bare ground and everything beyond it. The visitor would state their situation. New claim, timber on 3 sides, creek on 1, children, livestock, limited cash. Clara would ask 3 questions. What is the soil? What is the slope? How much time do you have before you need shelter? Then she would walk the site. She carried Jonas's glass tube level and her own rope, pre-knotted at 10-foot intervals for measuring. She would test the soil with a shovel, 1 cut, 2 inches deep, enough to see if the mineral layer was close or buried under feet of organic duff. She would sight the drainage with the level. She would pace the perimeter she recommended, planting sticks at the boundary, and she would tell the family the truth. This is how wide your ring needs to be. This is how many days it will take. This is what you must clear before you drive your first nail. Some families listened, some did not. Clara learned to recognize the ones who would not, the ones who nodded politely, asked about the shelter design, and then went home to build a conventional cabin with a 50-foot yard and a shake roof because the labor of a 100-foot ring was more than they were willing to invest in something invisible. She did not argue with them. She told them what the fire had taught her, and she let them choose. But she noticed that the families who cut corners tended to be the families who had not been in the valley during the burn. The survivors built her way. The newcomers gambled. Collis was her best student. The young Sawyer, who had carried nail kegs up the hill in secret, had become by the following spring a competent builder in the Voss method. He could sound timber by ear, cut a drainage swale to grade, and calculate overburden depth by counting beam diameters. He had helped 3 families build shelters on the east side of the valley, and each one bore his particular signature: slightly wider entrance trenches than Clara recommended because Collis was tall and did not like stooping, and stone-lined ventilation channels instead of stovepipe because stone was free and stovepipe was not. Clara approved of the variations. The method was not a recipe. It was a set of principles: dirt does not burn, bare ground does not carry flame, mass absorbs heat, and the application could change with every site, every family, every landscape. What could not change was the ring. The ring was Jonas's legacy and Clara's law, and Collis enforced it the same way Clara did. Measure first, clear first, build second. Always. Renfro, Collis's partner, had gone a different direction. He did not build buried shelters. He built conventional cabins with one modification: sod roofs and 100-foot clearances. His cabins looked like every other cabin in the territory.